Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome. This is the second webinar in our Matters of Care conference series, which is being hosted by the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford and is part of an EU-funded project called Taking Care. You can find out more about the Taking Care project from the project website or the Pitt Rivers Museum website. And you can also find out more information about all the webinars in our 6 weeks conference series. So thank you all for joining us. And before we get started and introduce my two fantastic colleagues and speakers that we have today, I just wanted to remind everyone that each of these webinars is being recorded. So you will have a chance to see them after the event. They will be posted on the Pitt Rivers website as well as the Taking Care project website. So do look out for those recordings. Please feel free today to put any general comments using the chat function. Talk to other participants as well as us and the panel. But if you'd like to ask questions of the speakers, please use the Q&A function. And then towards the end, we'll start gathering all of those questions and ask our speakers. So you can use the Q&A function throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait until the end. So please, as you watch and listen to the talks, just as your questions come up, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. I also wanted to introduce each week of the conference series. We have a student based at the University of Oxford, both in anthropology, archaeology, and in geography departments, who is live tweeting about our webinars. So they're taking over our Pitt Rivers Twitter account and live tweeting about all of the interesting things that they hear, but also in general, any comments they have. And so today, our guest live tweeter is Alice Saunders, and she's a master's student in Nature, Society and Environmental Governance at the Oxford University Centre for the Environment. So a very warm welcome to Alice, and thanks for joining us. So it's now my absolute pleasure to start the second of our Matters of Care conference series. And this week, we're going to be hearing from two inspiring and engaging speakers about themes to do with environmental justice and community conservation. And the real purpose, I think, for us in this Taking Care project and series of webinars, as the project is very much rooted in ethnographic and world cultures museums, and in thinking about themes of planetary precarity and how we reactivate our collections, the communities we work with and our visitors. One of the themes that we wanted to explore is relationship of environmental justice, community conservation, but have outside perspectives, so have interdisciplinary perspectives. So today we have two speakers, one from environmental anthropology, one from international development. And so we're really excited to bring together very different ideas about these themes. And so our first speaker is Dr. Paulina Von Hellermann, and Paulina is a senior lecturer in anthropology at Goldsmiths, University of London in the UK. And Paulina is an environmental anthropologist, so she's going to talk today about her perspectives from environmental anthropology, and especially her perspectives in thinking through the project themes with us. She has a lot of interest in environmental justice, political ecology, science policy processes, youth and patronage politics. But her major research project at the moment is a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship, which she holds for a project entitled Red Gold, a Global Environmental Anthropology of Palm Oil. And so As she's writing a book during this project, she's looking at the historical ecology of palm oil in West Africa. So that includes local beliefs, knowledge, and practice about it, but also the discovery of palm oil as part of the 19th century trade boom and use in industry. So we're very excited to hear and welcome you today, Paulina, as our first speaker. And then I'll go ahead and introduce our second speaker as well. And we have with us today Dr. Iokiñe Rodríguez Fernandez. And Iokiñe is a sociologist, senior lecturer in international development at the University of East Anglia, also in the UK. And her work focuses on environmental conflict transformation, issues of local history, local knowledge, power, environmental justice, equity, and intercultural dialogue. So she's built and led institutional capacity in lots of environmental conflicts throughout South America. One of the topics that she's been actively engaged in is the issue of forestry conservation and logging, which is actually something that Paulina has also worked quite a lot on in West Africa, looking at forest and logging and transformation of communities and livelihoods based on extractive industries such as logging. And so they both have a wealth of experience and really looking forward to hearing from both of you today. So we thank you very much for being a part of this, and we welcome you very much. So the floor is over now to you, Paulina, to hear from you.
Thank you very much for inviting me this morning. I'm going to be talking first of all about environmental anthropology as a whole, just to kind of contextualize things a little bit, especially for possible non-anthropologists in the audience. But then I will really focus on, as Ashley was saying, on my current project and the book I'm trying to write, and in particular, the chapter I'm currently working on, which as when a sort of discussion before this panel, we sort of realized there were quite a lot of parallels or sort of interesting similarities with some of the challenges museums face today. I should say, however, that I haven't even started writing this chapter. I'm still in the preparation stage. And so what it is, it's sort of more about the challenges I'm thinking about at the moment, rather than really the solutions I found to these challenges. Sorry, just to add as well, so I'm focusing more on historical work today, but environmental justice and community conservation are both things I do work on a lot as well. So I might not be talking about it directly, but indirectly it will be in there. And I'm very happy to talk about these things more broadly in the questions and answers later as well. So I'm going to start very briefly with cultural ecology as it sort of started more or less in the 1950s and 70s. Julian Stewart is sort of one of the big forefathers here. He worked on the Shoshone in the Great Basin in America and looked at really how ecology or environment shape cultures. And another sort of big proponent or big work of this time, or a little bit later, is Roy Rappaport's Pigs for the Ancestors. Both of these are sort of real classic cultural ecology work where and in Pigs for the Ancestors, Rappaport looked at how the Tsimbaga in Papua New Guinea have a sort of Kaipo pig festival that regulates, where his argument is that this sort of seemingly irrational festival actually worked to regulate the environment in a very sophisticated and good way. So this kind of cultural ecology was innovative and interesting and sort of challenging a lot of prejudices at the time, but it was also very sort of bounded. It was very functionalist and materialistic. It was really rooted in a very much sort of balance of nature way of thinking of the sort of equilibrium and everything sort of in a sort of framework of ecology at the time. And also as anthropology as a whole in what James Ferguson and others have sort of broadly called now in retrospect the sort of peoples and places approach, where you're very much looking at one people in one place and also very ahistorical. So out of this, as a sort of response or a critique to this, from the 1980s came political ecology. The term political ecology was actually first used by the anthropologist Eric Wolf in 1972. which is particularly nice because Eric Wolf played a big role in kind of bringing about this shift in really introducing political economy and history to anthropology as a whole. So it's nice that he was actually the first one to use this term. However, it didn't really sort of become anything big until the 1980s, with geographers, in particular Piers Blakey, really taking on political ecology. And basically political ecology is about sort of really going beyond those very narrow bounded ways of thinking about environment and society, and really bringing in larger connections and political economy and sort of quite a lot of different perspectives, a lot of Marxist approaches, but also post-structuralist discourse analysis, small scale, large scale. It's quite a wide field, but it's broadly all about bringing together political economy and nature. Just one example of a sort of more recent collection is the sort of work nowadays is not with traditional societies at all, but can be about any policy or any sort of modern context. But another field that also arose as a sort of critique or response to cultural ecology is historical ecology, which really addressed the sort of lack of history in cultural ecology. One of the first people here was Carol Crumley here. Then also William Ballet, who works on the Amazon, is one of the sort of big key historical ecologists. And I also thought I would quickly mention a project I myself and in fact Ashley also worked on. This is how we met. We were both at part of the historical ecologies of East African landscapes program at York University when Ashley was doing her PhD and I was doing a postdoc. So it's a sort of field that brings together anthropologists, but also a lot of archaeologists and also ecologists themselves also have really started to think about ecology historically. And in all this, there's a lot more history, a very sort of long-term understanding of human nature or human ecology interactions. It's also informed by what is known as disequilibrium ecology, a sort of real shift that is taking place within ecology itself that ecologists now think much more in terms of not order, but sort of disequilibrium and chaos being far more sort of normal part of ecological processes than what was assumed before. And also, I suppose, a sort of very open-ended nature-culture understanding of how humans and nature interact. And here, I would say that's sort of where Ashley mentioned briefly my previous work. I'm just putting it in here. I myself would situate myself really in between or using both political ecology and historical ecology. And it's a position not that many people do use both actually, in the sense of looking at current policies and sort of political economy, but always really engaging with the long-term ecology as well. But I found that work, I like this position, I like this combination very much, and it really, for me, is one of the most sort of useful ways or productive ways of thinking about how people interact with the environment. But it also, as I was preparing this course, I kind of realized it's also a position, I suppose, that I adopted sort of in response to ongoing issues and discussions within anthropology as a whole, which I've now broadly put in here as the other, which is about the whole idea that people began to think about the sort of colonial legacies of anthropology, the problem of always writing about the other, which is always with quotation marks, and of course the whole sort of crisis of representation, which George Marcus's Writing Culture book was really, and Clifford Geertz's book was really about this sort of idea that how can you ever claim to write holistic ethnographies to describe another whole people? So all these things sort of, I suppose, came together in sort of making me, positioning myself sort of really much more in history and political economy than in actually sort of ethnography writing. So in the end, I didn't really write an ethnography at all. And I was really kind of much more writing about historical processes and also much more about colonialism rather than the other so much. And I suppose another thing I want to mention here is that in all this, I also had a, if you like, a slightly disenchanted sort of viewpoint, in the sense that I suppose my overall position has always been more about discovering or writing more about, if you like, anthropology is always about things being different, but also how things are often very much the same in different parts of the world. And so maybe I was sort of by disposition always sort of veering more towards that, the sort of thinking about actors more or less the same in different places in the world. However, another sort of area of environmental anthropology that's sort of really been coming up since the 2000s is cosmological perspectivism, which is sort of almost the exact opposite of this. Viveiros de Castro is sort of the biggest sort of anthropologist sort of behind this term, and he works on the Amazon, and this is where he really developed this perspective. And basically, it's to summarize it very briefly here. If in the West, we tend to think of there being one nature and then many different cultural ways of thinking about it, there in the Amazon, as Viveiros de Castro described it, the view is that basically there's one culture, one sort of way of living in the world, which both humans and jaguars and any other animals live in this sort of one cultural way, or the same sort of cultural way. But then there are many natures around this. So for example, the famous example he always talks about is the idea of manioc beer. For a jaguar, we might see blood somewhere, but for the jaguar, when he sees, or when a jaguar sees blood, it's like the jaguar's manioc beer. So, so that, yeah, like jaguars and humans basically interact with the world in the same way, but they have different substances that have the same meaning for them. And so Viveiros de Castro then sort of really, what his point is really that it's a sort of very fundamentally different ontology, and also going sort of one step further. And this is why he sort of describes himself as this being a bit of a bomb in terms of its impact on anthropology, that he's really saying that it's not just about describing an Amazonian sort of point of view, but also that it's about us adopting and really inhabiting that position ourselves. So it's a much more radical departure than just sort of categorizing or classifying things. Now, first, as you can imagine from the position my work was sort of rooted in, I was a little bit sort of skeptical or I suppose resistant to these perspectives. And I should add, I'm not the only one. There is quite a big sort of political critique of this, because of course it is in many ways a whole sort of it's sort of really a big return to the other in many ways. And if you then think about the sort of larger sort of context of decolonization and sort of really big sort of anti-racist movements within anthropology itself, the sort of lack of politics and this sort of description is put of people as being fundamentally different, I always found a little bit problematic. But in fact, Viveiros de Castro and others who inhabit this sort of position, or who have really provoked, sort of thought about and worked on this a lot, have actually escaped this, have not really been accused of this very much, mostly because they really claim, and it's true, it's been very good at actually saying this is what decolonization itself is about, that it's the classifying and categorization that is really what colonial anthropology still, or what anthropology still does, just as in the colonial period. But if we leave that altogether, then that is what true decolonization is. And it has, what has been really remarkable, that it has all really opened up environmental anthropology and produced a lot more really imaginative and sort of radically different kinds of ways of writing and thinking about the world. So this is sort of where we're at now. We have what is called Anthropocene anthropology, what might broadly be called sort of multi-species or more than human or beyond human, which has a lot of these sort of, in one way or another, I suppose, inspired by cosmological perspectivism approaches, but and also Latour's acton network theory, that we that basically that you sort of take other species, but also objects or plants much more seriously and take them as seeing them as agents themselves. And then at the same time, what is, I suppose, the behind all this as well is, of course, the sort of climate emergency that we're all now more and more aware of, and the sort of real absolute need, urgent need to think radically different about how we can think about human environment relations or human ecology, human nature relations. And this is sort of what I've called here possibilities, and this is borrowed from David Graeber, but the idea that what anthropology really offers is just making us aware that there's so many different ways of thinking about and living and interacting with the world. For all these, I've just realized the ethnography, crossed out ethnography was meant to appear at this moment. It was here all along, but I just wanted to finish this overview by talking about the role of ethnography in all this, because whilst on the whole there aren't any real sort of tensions, or generally aren't really seen to be any tensions between the sort of decolonization and anti-racist agenda and the sort of multi-species Anthropocene anthropology, the sort of really blossoming, flourishing environmental anthropology at the moment. First of all, in general, I always learned so much from ethnography and ethnographic writing about Africa, and it is also one of the best ways to actually engage and think through a lot of the problems with colonialism and representation and all these sort of things by looking at the actual material. And then again, in this sort of, if you like, possibilities approach, I've sort of suddenly sort of rediscovered a bit of a love for ethnography, just in the sense of all this knowledge and stuff being out there that is a little bit of a shame not to engage with. So having not really ever written ethnography myself, or having had a very sort of much more political ecology kind of way of thinking about the world, I am now actually rediscovering this a little bit and re-engaging. And this is what I wanted to focus on with regard to the chapter I'm working on at the moment. So here now, quickly, I will first give an overall overview of the project I'm working on, and in particular the book I'm trying to write. Just as a little bit of background, I was reading a book about cotton, and I just one of those sort of general one commodity books, and I just realized there wasn't really a book like that about palm oil, and also that none of these books are ever really rooted in environmental anthropology. So I thought I could maybe write that book. So that's what I'm sort of set out to do, and what I then got funding for from the Leverhulme Trust, who of course Leverhulme made all their money in palm oil. So I thought they would be a good bet for getting funding. And then I set out, so this is what I'm working on at the moment. And the idea is basically a book that does sort of everything palm oil, but also in each of the chapters really engages with environmental anthropology in a, hopefully in a sort of way that is accessible to the public, but also, well, this is the idea, also as a sort of way of thinking about palm oil, but also really thinking about environmental anthropology. So it has three main parts. The first one is the, if you like, the history, so the long-term historical ecology, then palm oil in pre-colonial West Africa, and then the sort of what Ashley already briefly talked about, the so what I call the second palm oil boom, because the first one, in fact, was around 3,000 years ago, when really there was a massive increase in, this is in the first chapter, in oil palm growth, and also palm oil use amongst humans in West Africa. But the second palm oil boom is the one about the 19th century industrial revolution, and really masses and masses of palm oil being furnished by West African farmers. And then the second, if you like, sort of biggest part of the book is about the actual global industrial complex of palm oil today, with one chapter on plantations. And I have to say, plantations are amazingly interesting, actually, as a whole microcosm of sort of modernity, basically. science, planning, everything, and nature control. It's there. So, and then one on North Sumatra, which is one of the historically the biggest, earliest palm oil producing area, Indonesia. Indonesia is now the biggest producer of palm oil in the world. And yeah, so I'll be looking at smallholders, plantations, Medan, this big metropole, which kind of grew out entirely out of the rubber and palm oil plantation economy. And the sort of, all the complex sort of players and sort of landscapes there. And then the supply chain processing, I won't, all of this I could talk about for hours, but I won't, but that is then sort of, that chapter is about the actual substance of palm oil, and it can be used in so many different, the chemistry of it all is quite hard to understand and get your head around, but it's extremely actually amazing, all the things you can do and how complex these supply chains are. And then how palm oil, of course, is in so much processed food. It's really sort of at the heart of the sort of all the bad food we eat all over the world at the moment, and the sort of processed, modern, convenience, quick food, like just one example, Indomie noodles, which are made with palm oil and are eaten all over the world now. And then the last section is on fallout, protests and politics. Of course, the massive ecological and social impact, but also and the sort of protests, the Greenpeace and boycotting movements, reform from within, the certification policy worlds, and then a sort of final of thinking about entanglement, but also possibilities. However, so all of these are sort of, I suppose, that really captures where environmental anthropology, or where my own thinking is, because it really does have this amazing breadth and is also very well equipped to deal with all of these different aspects, and in particular today, sort of policy and sort of issues today. But the chapter I'm working on at the moment, and I wanted to talk about today, is palm oil in pre-colonial West Africa, which is turning out to be very difficult because of all the issues I talked about before. So I am kind of, I know why I want to include it, because, well, partly because it is part of the holistic understanding of palm oil, but also I suppose because people really don't know anything about, people are working with the sort of, especially the critics of palm oil, and I don't want to come out as a sort of palm oil lobbyist here, but people always sort of say the stuff, or they think about it as something really bad in itself, which of course it isn't actually. So it's kind of, I mean, it's just a plant and an oil, so there isn't anything intrinsically evil about it. So it's sort of part of a holistic understanding, and it also is, I suppose, very interesting for Indigenous knowledge, or the sort of, both in terms of just appreciating all the different things that were being done, but also how a lot of them were really, for example, soap making on oil for lamps, all these things were really there even long before they were discovered in Europe or elsewhere in the world. And then thirdly, so it's a sort of, yeah, appreciating, I suppose. And then thirdly, just in the ongoing sort of attempt to think about reimagining or thinking about different possibilities of, it's also important for that sort of way of knowing that palm oil doesn't have to be all about large scale plantations, but can be lived with and used in many different ways. And so yes, I know I will write about sort of how palm oil was made, processing, and all this sort of technical knowledge, the social world, the social organization going into it. Then of course the use of palm oil, which is in food. It's extremely central to all West African, West African cuisine in the palm oil areas. And food itself is also very important in West Africa in different ways. It's also used as medicine, for example, as ointment, as an anti-poison treatment, for skin, for lots of different medical uses. It's used as a building material. You see here a picture of the Benin walls, the Benin city. And palm oil was used there as building, soap making, food, but also the symbolism of palm oil, which is used a lot in rituals and religious meaning. And of course here you see, for example, the Oba of Benin, the current Oba, in a sort of very recent photograph where at the very bottom, you can see an oil palm at the bottom of his robe, because oil palm is really, in the Benin Kingdom, but in so many other areas as well, a real symbol of wealth and power, because it is so important in so many ways. So there are lots of interesting things to write about, but the how is what I'm really struggling with. So in terms of, yeah, so this was meant to be coming in one after the other, but just very quickly, one of the, I suppose, ever problems in all this, in any sort of writing of this kind, when you have a very big area with lots of different peoples and traditions and histories, and also, of course, covering quite a long time period, how do you write about it in an accessible but sort of non-essentializing way? And then also the problem of, which I have struggled with throughout in my work, is how do you write about a sort of pre-colonial past when sources are very, limited, and there's never really a knowing way of writing about, in 1500, I mean, you can never evoke that world without actually, it's all based on, a lot of it is based on present day observations and sort of, so there's a lot of sort of problems with that. I always struggle with that a lot. And then my third, I suppose, is how magical. This is an ongoing problem just for me, because I don't really do this sort of writing, but it also links, of course, all these three link to the sort of larger issues that I talked about before. How do you write about this in a way that actually is, I suppose, works for different audience, both for my sort of Goldsmith anthropology colleagues who are kind of dismantling everything at the moment, and also a wider audience, and also, I suppose, what I can do. I mean, what I can actually do. So possible strategies are the classic vignettes, how to, then you don't have to do everything, but then which ones do I focus maybe on the Benin Kingdom, which of course is so much in the news at the moment, and which happens to be my research area, but there's so many other areas and lots of material, really interesting ethnographic material from other parts of West Africa. Then how to write about the pre-colonial past. One strategy, which I suppose could be called provenance, which is actually a word I learned from you, Ashley, because I didn't know the word until we worked together, but the history of an object, or rather the history of a fact, that you can always write about both what you're writing about, the actual fact or story, but also about how thinking about the provenance at the same time. And then, yeah, the biggest problem, I suppose, or the issue for me remains is how much to go into this sort of, because people, the sort of creating this life world, which is so different to us, me, I mean, I don't know, Eastbourne, where I am now, 2021, how do you do this? Like, because there is so much wonderful and interesting material, but how to write about it in a way that isn't othering too much, and that I can do. And so that's sort of what I'm struggling. So my only strategy at the moment is just to keep on reading, thinking, writing, and eventually, hopefully, I will find a way to deal with this, but I will stop for now.
Thank you, Paulina. Iokiñe, are you happy to start with your presentation?
Okay, so I'll start sharing my screen. So I mean, I'm really thankful for Paulina for her presentation, because it really puts into context really nicely what I want to talk to you about, but from a different perspective. So I mean, what Paulina and I do as researchers is very much linked. From what I do a lot is also political ecology, but from a conflict transformation perspective, I focus more on the environmental injustices around all the dimension of historical and political ecology that Paulina was referring to. And I very much engage with asymmetries of power. So the structural, cultural, and relational causes that create environmental injustice. And I really, through my research, I try to engage in a way that we can use research to. So what I want to talk to you about is it's in a way related, very much related to what Paulina was sharing with us. But my work more at the level of communities undergoing struggles of environmental injustices, and how I use action research as a tool for cultural revitalization and bringing about intercultural dialogues around environmental injustices. but I'll tell you a little bit of what I do. But I also want to focus my presentation a little bit on this link with the museums, because it's something that I found fascinating when Ashley invited us to have this talk today, is how can we actually engage more? How can we produce a more sort of connection between museums and the research that we carry out? Because I think there is huge potential there for working together and using museums as a way of really sharing with the wider society the research that we do, and I think there's a lot to be done there. So I'm going to divide my presentation in 4 sections. One's a little bit telling you why I do action research and how I do it. Then how I think museums can help in this challenge of bringing about greater environmental justice. And I will illustrate this through 2 case studies one that I worked with since 20 years ago, and I'm still working on, although at a more distance, in Venezuela, where I come from, and the other one in Colombia, where I'm working currently now through a collaboration with Colombian researchers. And then just one idea of looking ahead. How do I think this research can help us? How do I see this relationship between museums and research moving ahead? And I want to start my story about how I do environmental action research and how I try to bring about this articulation of knowledges and using research as a medium for intercultural dialogues through a story, and basically a story that has been very influential in my life as a researcher. And is when I went back to do my PhD in Venezuela in the 1990s in Canaima National Park, which is one of the cases that I will talk to you about. All of my work was with this Pemon leader. He's called Juvencio Gomez. And I went back, I was doing work there with them on understanding environmental conflicts and trying to help with environmental conflict management. And things weren't working out very well. So I decided to do my PhD on it to understand why. And I went back with the intention of doing what Paulina was referring to, a bit of a more ethnographic research to try to really understand what environmental conflicts are about, because I think we sometimes engage with them without really understanding the complexities around it, as Paulina was telling us with the reference to palm oil. And I went to him asking if I could base myself in his community to study conflicts and to understand the complexity of environmental conflicts from a political ecology perspective. And this is what he told me, which is something that I had never given any thought to. I always thought that environmental conflicts were very much a result of tensions between, powerful actors like companies, governments, and communities in the struggle, in these very asymmetrical situations. And all we had to do was to level power relations between that powerful actor and communities. But he said to me at that time, and this was at the end of 1990s, he says, studying conflicts for you is fine, but we don't have time. We need to act now. In 2 or 3 years, it might be too late for us. You can stay as long as you help me and my village reflect about who we are and who we want to be in the future. He said, we, the Pemon, don't know where we are going because of all the projects that are being imposed in our territory. We're totally disoriented, and we need to be clear about who we are and who we want to be as a people. So this completely threw me out of my comfort zone, because what he was saying was, the problem with the environmental conflicts is not so much, from his perspective, this tension between the powerful actors and the communities, but these processes of cultural fragmentation and erosion that are really putting communities at disadvantage and making them, putting them in a very difficult situation to be able to respond to external pressures and to projects and policies because of lack of clarity of not only how to negotiate projects, but what they really want out of them, and how much of what they were or are in terms of their cultural identity they want to retain, and how do they negotiate these flexible boundaries of identities of these modern times. So what he asked me to do at that time, which I committed to while I was doing my research, was to help him develop what he heard the Colombians were already doing, was community indigenous life plans. A life plan that helped them reflect on their past, reconnect with their identities, reflect seriously about who they are, the current pressures, and think ahead from that point of departure. So I started using, so this was a negotiation we agreed. It was that I could continue basing myself in his community, doing this reflective process, but this didn't take away from me the possibility of continuing to do my own research. So I was doing like two things at the same time, trying to understand conflicts from a political ecology perspective, but also committing myself to having a contribution at the community level through participatory research. So I continuously move in my research within these two agendas. But as I started working on this request that Juvencio Gomez made to me, and when I was doing my fieldwork, is actually something that has continued to arise in my work with indigenous peoples in Latin America. And this is, for instance, Gregorio Mirabal, who's currently the president of COICA, is the Union of Indigenous Communities of the Amazon Basin. And he told me in one meeting that we had, also a workshop with indigenous leaders in Venezuela, something very similar. Is the need that communities have to actually be more proactive with governments, and not only tell them what the problems are, but also have a possibility of participating on how they imagine their future. So this is this idea that being able to have opportunities to think through how they want to engage with public policies and actors to propose solutions is something that is very much present from the part of indigenous leaders throughout Latin America. I would say this idea also of unearthing their past. This is something that also comes about in my conversations and work with indigenous peoples, but also the need to revitalize and rescue traditional rules and norms of governing, not only for the sake of research, just as an interest, but because their livelihoods depend on being able to reconnect with the knowledge that is actually being lost and eroded through this cultural change and livelihood change. And the idea that not only is a matter of rescuing for reviving knowledge, but also changing their relationship around not only being communities receptors of knowledge from the outside, but also the possibility of communities also teaching other people, teaching the people that they engage with about their history, their ways of lives, and their ways of government. So this is where the intercultural dialogue dimension of my work comes in. So using research as a tool for changing the terms of conversation, and also allowing communities to teach others about who they are. So my research very much tries to contribute to all this, with the view of helping to enrich what is already out there. Some indigenous researchers themselves are developing this idea of an indigenous research agenda. So this is Linda Smith, indigenous researcher from New Zealand, who has developed this very fascinating book that's very useful, which I learned about some years ago after having, in a way, started doing this in a more sort of empirical way. Indigenous peoples are talking about the need to recognize that they themselves have a research agenda. It's not only us as researchers that go to do research, they also are developing and want to develop their own research agenda. And it's a research agenda that has at the core the idea to strengthen their self-determination. And this agenda is a complex agenda that involves engaging with things like healing, eventually at different levels, mobilizing for environmental justice, but also for social justice, bringing about transformations at different levels, at the personal level, social level, collective level, and of course, systemic change. And it's all about decolonizing research in a way, and decolonizing the relationship between indigenous peoples and others. Others in the other way that we were referring to, Paulina was referring to. Others in this way refers to us. So the work that I do is very much, in a way, I don't do it. I'm not an indigenous person, so I can't say I do in this. I don't do an indigenous research agenda, but I try to fit into what I believe is out there, which is an indigenous research agenda, still from a political ecology perspective and conflict transformation perspective. So I move around these two agendas. So how I think museums can play in this process. What role can they play in connecting with this type of knowledge that indigenous peoples need to strengthen and revitalize in order to be able to have this dialogue with others in more equal terms. Well, I haven't really given much thought to that. I'm not an expert in museums or curating for exhibitions, but I have found through my research, interestingly, thinking through this when Ashley invited us to give this presentation, I have actually seen that my work in the past has engaged with research with museums, and you will see how, and at this particular level, through democratizing and resignifying past tangible heritage that is already existing in collections. And I'll show you how this has happened. And I'm also working now in Colombia in using the resource of my research to create museographic exhibitions that helps make the knowledge that we are helping to revitalize and rebuild at the community level, make it known to others. So I think it's interesting, maybe for the conversation we can have afterwards, of thinking of how do we as museums work at these two levels, trying to give a different meaning to what is already there in the collections and how this connects to environmental knowledge that communities have there and they need to connect with in their own past, and also how we can help use museums to make visible not only injustices per se, but the knowledge that is there in the communities that other people and we as a wider society need to know that is there. So I want to go quickly through the case studies. The first case study, which is the one that I was referring to, has actually started me with this research approach, is the idea of the Pemon Life Plan, which involved a group of 13 people from the village I'm going to refer to in the Canaima National Park, trying to help them build their life plan, and I'll tell you what this is all about shortly. So Canaima National Park is in the south of Venezuela, and the boundary is very, very close to Brazil and Guyana. It was in its origins the biggest national park of the world. So 3 million hectares is the ancestral land of the Pemon indigenous peoples, who amount to approximately 20 to 25,000 people. It's a UNESCO Natural World Heritage Site, and it's beautiful. It's absolutely stunning. It's where the Angel Falls are found, the Table Mountains, and it's an area that has had a very long history of environmental conflicts, and this is why I started working there in the 1990s. So this is the sort of natural outstanding outstanding natural features that they can see there. For those that haven't been there, of course, it would be nice if you can go sometime in your life. It's absolutely beautiful. And these are the Pemon. I'm not going to talk at all about their cultural characteristics because we don't have time, but we can do it if you have any questions later. And the conflicts that have been taking place there for over the last decades are varied. They have to do with livelihood uses that are considered a threat to conservation, like fire, widespread use of forest fires and savanna fires for different activities, tourism, of course, hunting slash and burn agriculture, and more recently, the building of a power line to export electricity to Brazil, which is linked to one of the biggest water energy generator for Venezuela, which is the Guri Dam. And for the country, for the state, it's been a huge strategic importance to conserve the forests of this area. And around the issue of forest conservation, there has been a lot of conflict in this area. And so this is where I did I use Cumarcapai as my base. This is where Juvencio Gomez was born, and so when he asked me to base myself in his community to help them build their community life plan, we had to start basically from scratch and doing this, because neither him or I had done this before. I had resort to some participatory methodologies that I had used in the past, but it was very much a process of co-creation, which started by reconstruct the past of the community and developing a process of reconnection with their ancestral territories, and which took about a year, and it involved a wide range of participatory methodologies that are used for mapping the territory, developing, reconstructing the history, also analyzing socio-ecological change through different participatory methodologies, and doing all sorts of activities through workshops and meetings to visualize the future. And the sort of questions that we asked ourselves were, where do we come from? What is the history of the community? How has our community and territory changed over time? Things that we need to solve to improve the living conditions and the environment. What are the views of development of the community? What are the good and bad things of the past and present, and which is the type of society that we want? And what is important of all this process is that while we were doing this, the elders requested from us that we publish this in a book. And then, of course, the question arises that whose book? And I made it very clear from the beginning that was going to be their book, and I was helping them collect the information, but trying to contribute with this idea of self-determination and building their own, respecting their own knowledge and their own research agenda. It was clear to me that that was their research agenda, and I had another research agenda. I was just facilitating this process for them. So my commitment was I would help them collect the information, but that they would write the book. And I left my field work, and the information was left there, but there was always this concern of mine whether the book would be written or not. So I finished my PhD, and then I went back to the community 2 years later, and the book was not written. But there was still the increasing concern that this book should come out. So I agreed that we would help to put the book together. And finally, 10 years after a lot of reworking and updating of the information, we published this book in 2010. And this was it was a really, really important process for them to do, and it was quite crucial for them to finish the commitment from the elders and the youngsters to produce this book, because it's what actually has made them feel that there is a broader recognition of who they are. Because what's happened is with development in the region, development has the environmental conflicts have the consequence of erasing people's identities and their connection to the land. So positioning themselves publicly with a book has given the Pemon an important sense of not only dignity, but also wider recognition of their identity. And there is a process of revitalization of the culture among the younger generations as well. Now, I want to share very quickly a video of the launching of this book, because what happened in the ceremony was that it was such a good opportunity for the Pemon to invite all the institutions and all the actors that they engage with that are continuously ignoring them as a culture and as a society to this event. And I'm going to share it's only 4 minutes, what the story about the launching of this book. And the reference to at the beginning of the video, you will say that there's a reference to Macunaíma. Macunaíma is the ancestral hero of the Pemon. Is not the grandfather real. Is their oldest ancestral. It's a cultural hero who gives origin to their own culture. So he's referred to in the book, so that you know who he is. And then I just want to refer to something more after. Why I think the reason I'm showing this is because I think it can help us imagine how museums can play a role in promoting events like this one. Okay.
El abuelo Macunaíma no nos enseñó a nosotros a escribir o a editar libros. De manera que un acto como esto no forma parte de la cultura ancestral del Pemón. Y lo que ustedes conocen como un bautizo o un bautismo de una obra no es lo mismo en el acto ancestral Pemón. Y para que se entienda, claro, nuestra intención es que se entienda cabalmente, lo cual no es una tarea fácil. Me han dado este momento corto para que le explique a quienes no conocen la cultura Pemón en qué va a consistir el acto, lo que como un bautismo de una obra literaria. El acto que vamos a hacer hoy, el Pemón cualquier objeto, herramienta, incluso el niño cuando nace, se le hace ese acto. Chiucar. Chiucar significa pasarlo por ese acto para que se proteja de los peligros que vienen adelante. Y si se trata de un objeto, para que el objeto cumpla su función sin ningún tipo de dificultades. Tratándose específicamente de una olla de barro, una olla de barro se chiuca para que no se rompa cuando se le sirva el primer tuma y se ponga en el fogón. De manera que el acto que vamos a hacer hoy de chiucar el libro se trata de hacer esa ceremonia para que el libro cumpla la función para el cual fue escrito y que en ese cumplimiento de su función nada lo pueda detener. Gracias.
Se procede a hacer la ceremonia
Okay, the reason why I wanted to show the video because to give you a sense of the sense of pride that they had by finishing the book, but also because again, trying to connect back to museums, one of the things that was quite important for this book was that we have the book is the result of a participatory research that took a long time, but it also implied doing a lot of work of our archival record collection. A lot of it was in the homes of the Pemon themselves, but it was in very bad state, and they were photographs that were taken in the beginning of the century of their ancestors, and this is a sample of them, of early explorers that visited the Gran Sabana in the late 1980s, and we had access to this. We were able to publish these materials because they were found, the original ones, we knew where they were, and we were able to ask for collaboration from the Gothenburg Museum in Sweden to make use of this material. And it was very important for them in terms of telling their stories, because these are the photographs of their ancestors. For us, they're just any indigenous peoples, but for them, these people have names. And Serimada, as you can see in the bottom of the photograph, is what we call the head grandfather that brought about all eventually many of the people that are currently living in Kumarapapai. So that's a way, in a way, finding out what is out there in existing collections that can help indigenous people reconnect with their past and tell their stories is the way that I think existing collections can have an important part in the research that we do. And the other, I'm going to try to do this really very quickly because I think we're running out of time. And the other example that I want to share with you is the current research that I'm doing in Colombia through a very big collaborative research that we're doing with community researchers and school teachers in Tolima, is the central area of Colombia. And this is called the School Territory and Post-Conflict Project. It takes place in this central area. Tolima is in red. It's the core central area of Colombia, and is an area that has a long protracted history of armed conflict with the guerrilla and the government. But it also has a long history of peace building from schools and from community organizations. And we wanted to see if we could help put those experiences at the forefront of peace building policies. And this is what this project has been about. We've been doing research with community organizations to understand how the different forms of conflict has affected communities and their relationship in schools, but also how we can reconnect with their environment and the territory to build peace building strategies that are really rooted in what communities and schools consider are viable and interesting and useful possibilities ahead. And so we've been working with eight schools and 8 community organizations with 2 ideas. One is to understand how the armed conflict has transformed life in school, but also how community organizations have been throughout the decades, developing peace building strategies there. And we've also been using this, we don't say that we use an Indigenous research agenda here, because it's not only Indigenous peoples, but we are working with participatory action research with a variety of methodologies, similar and expanding on the ones that I've used with the PEMON, because we're using here more workshops, big workshops that bring together communities and the schools in reflective workshops, musographic exhibitions to share knowledge through their own findings. And at the community level, we're using a variety of methodologies as well. There are participatory methodologies, more conventional ones, but others that are more adventurous, like theater of the oppressed, participatory video, etc. And so this is just a sample of the methods that we use. And so we have been using musographic exhibitions as a tool for dialogue. So on the left, you have teachers sharing with community organizations the results of their research mapping conflicts in their territory and understanding different cultural meanings of the territory to them. And on the right, you have one of the community organizations decided to actually recreate a traditional dress, and in the dress do a process of cultural revitalizations through the dress, tell the history of the community. So you have two completely different methods for reconnecting with the territory and with the meanings of the landscape. And what it brings about is quite fascinating. And there are different dimensions of this project that have to do also with how different organizations have developed peace building strategies more from an environmental perspective and more from the political perspective. And we are also we are thinking of this. Our objective when we started this project was to use musographic exhibitions as a dissemination strategy. And because of COVID now, our plans have become a bit truncated, because we were hoping to do this, of course, face to face. And for this, we have produced with the communities that we're working with organizations, different outputs that are actually of relevance, like similar to the PEMON that we produced the book, which was their output. In this case, we're actually producing what we call talking maps, which are maps that are online videos and maps that the public can engage with. And as you see, all those little icons that are shown in that map are things that that people can open through internet and discover either stories or videos or pictures or testimonies that tell stories about how people connect with their territory. And we're also working with participatory videos and also a variety of co-produced books that have come out of this project in combination with the different organizations that we're working. So this is just a sample of how we are thinking of how I think that there's some connection there with museums. And just to finish looking ahead, so how do I think that sort of research that I do connects with museums? Well, I think one of the things that I mentioned in the case of the Pemon is by making accessible material from museum collections that can help local communities and organizations revitalize their culture, their knowledge, and their identities. So this means giving back to communities what is in collections and helping them reconnect, using them to reconnect with their knowledge and past. Also thinking about organizing exhibitions to disseminate this local knowledge that comes out of this type of research that seeks to revitalize knowledge and culture and their own, to get to know their own conflict transformation strategies that communities use. So working together to disseminate. And there's another thing that it's my own particular interest is, because of COVID, we have been having to think now, how can we put all this material in a way that is accessible online through online exhibitions. So we have thinking of turning the findings that we're hoping to disseminate in person into some sort of online exhibition. So this is something that it would be really interesting to think not only about how museums can turn their collections into more direct use to communities, but also how can museums assess, advise us as researchers on how to use museum methods to disseminate our research.
Thank you so much, Iokiñe. That was really fantastic. Really great to see all of your projects, but also thank you very much for thinking with us about how your methods, and especially I really enjoyed all of your kind of methodology in terms of participatory research and mapping, and also those fantastic outputs and how they might connect with museums and our ways of thinking and also our ways of celebrating this knowledge. And I think what you showed in the video was, as you say, it was incredibly empowering, but also really part of that participatory process, right? It's really about kind of the sharing of knowledge. I think one of the things from our perspective in last week's conversation, where we had discussions about how ethnographic and world cultures museums can be more relevant in terms of modern, bringing out these stories of historical narratives, but then how we bring the contemporary to the forefront. And so I think Paulina's work is a perfect example. She was talking about palm oil in the walls of Benin City, of course, and just in general, the historic use. So I was just thinking about all the possibilities of thinking through not only palm oil, but natural materials and extractive industries, and how we could actually tell those stories through our objects, but also thinking through these contemporary issues and how intertwined the past is. And I think that's what her work with historical ecology does so well, because it's very rooted in looking at historic knowledge systems and how relevant they are to contemporary society, but also contemporary problems. So I found that really fascinating.
About all this and ramifications of the palm oil industry in cultural meanings as well. Something that we don't think very much about. It would be fascinating to get for museums to help us understand more broadly what is behind the palm oil industry and use.
One of the real things that we're trying to talk through in the Taking Care project is all about how we think through these very difficult questions. And we're constantly grappling in the museum, your process, and Iokiñe, you also brought that through in terms of your process of presenting and thinking about how to share these knowledges, because you almost are you're in this position of holding and wanting to you're so enthusiastic about sharing this knowledge, but how do you do that in the most appropriate way, in the most ethical way, but also in a way that brings everyone in, that it's really a co-creation. And I mean, we're always thinking about that in terms of exhibitions, in terms of labels, in terms of how we activate our objects. So I very much value, you know, all of these thoughts today, because I think they're really helping us to kind of think through these issues together, really. So I'm going to start reading a couple of the questions that we've gotten from the question and answer. I'll start, Paulina, you've got a couple specifically about your project. So I'll just start with those two. So we have one question from Anna about your method of thinking with palm oil in contrast to thinking about. What does it mean to think with, and asking if this is rooted in actor network approach. And then another question from Cecilia about navigating the outcomes of the palm oil industry, considering your funding body, considering, you know, that you are funded by Leverhulme, and how, you know, how do you navigate that? So we'll start with those two.
Thank you. Yes, both very good questions. I suppose the thinking with was not so much rooted in actor network theory, although it could be related to that, but really about the Morris Bloch sort of trees are good to think with. So I was just sort of using that, re-quoting it to say palm oil is good to think with. And at that moment, when on my slide, I was also thinking more about how it's used symbolically in West Africa. So I wasn't actually thinking about myself so much, although that does apply. It is actually a very, yes, although I hadn't really thought about the thinking with as opposed to the thinking about. Oh yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of thinking, palm oil is a very, very useful starting point to think through a lot of issues. So in that sense, yes. But in terms of West Africa, it's, that palm oil is really used a lot symbolically for, so also in association. Sorry, now I am essentializing, sorry, in many different places in West Africa, you see instances of, for example, with certain, that red is often associated with sort of power and life, and it's sort of used, palm oil is therefore used symbolically just because it's red. I mean, what is interesting, for example, shea butter is just a different geographical area, and in the shea butter areas, it's shea butter that is used in many of it's used as a building material, soap making, body lotion. It's all this. It just happens to be in the palm oil area, use palm oil for it. So, but there is still beyond that, I suppose. So there's a sort of more pragmatic and prosaic way of thinking about it, which, but there is also a lot of the sort of the medicinal users of palm oil have a lot of it to do with it, about it being red and about other different kinds of properties that are sort of more symbolic. So there is so that's sort of what I meant there. The second question in terms of the Leverhulme, yes, and it's interesting, people have asked me this before, of course. I mean, the Leverhulme, I'm always asked this. I mean, the Leverhulme are a big funding body, and they are, in a way, one of the nicest around at the moment in terms of what it means institutionally and what they demand of you. So I do want to defend the Leverhulme. I mean, I don't think they're like an evil big corporate enterprise that is rooted in palm oil. And therefore, because I mean, why should, so then nobody should accept money from them if that were the case. But of course, in my case, I am aware of their roots. Yes, I suppose that is another whole ethical issue, which is completely different to what I was talking about today, which is what position, how critical I am of palm oil and of critical of corporations as a whole. I feel this will take yeah, it's something I'm grappling with a lot, but I'm trying to find a way that you, I mean, it's William, Lord Lever, or he was the founder of the Leverhulme Trust in 1925. And since then, the money isn't directly, it's not all about palm oil at this stage anymore anyway, but he is a very interesting figure, and I don't think it's particularly helpful to only think of him as a very, very bad person and everything is bad. But of course, to be extremely aware, but certainly in terms of how I'm writing, I'm just going to, and they are you know, there's no condition on me or anything about having to celebrate him or anything at all. It's just, I am doing this project and they funded it. So I will write whatever I want to write. But what I want to write isn't, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for those answers. And then the next two questions are really directed, well, at both of you really, but a little bit also for Iokiñe's presentation on the Pemón. So we've got two questions here that are related. So Cecilia asked about the Pemón and whether or not there are other historical ways of sharing and preserving knowledge that isn't writing. So songs, storytelling, and you talked a little bit about that at the end. And then a question from Claudia about, which is in relation to both of your talks really, about the use of ethnographies. So she writes that Indigenous groups are using old ethnographies for reconstructing their history and identity. What does this mean in relation to the problems of representation in ethnography? So related questions about really self-representation, but also an interesting question that brings up what you were saying, Paulina, about revisiting the ethnography, and is there a use for these ethnographies in our contemporary way of thinking, especially when we are, you know, decolonizing and sort of revolutionizing how we're trying to think about these things. So I open to both of you for your thoughts on. Oh,
I think Iokiñe made.
Yes,
there we go.
In relation to other ways of sharing histories, local histories, this is a really important question, because it's rightly so. Most Indigenous peoples are oral cultures. They actually between themselves transmit their knowledge much more orally than written, and it's a big challenge actually to write in Spanish, or even more in Pemón, because Pemón actually doesn't exist as one language. As many, there are like 4 different subdivisions of the bigger sort of there are actually Tarepan, Arecuna, Camaracoto, that different subdivisions of a bigger sort of Caribe language, Carib language. So writing it even in Pemón, in Tarepan, Camaracoto, Arecuna, it's difficult because there are not phonetic agreements on how to write it. So writing is a big challenge, and it's part of the downfall of writing. And I've started working more now with video, participatory video, as another way of reconstructing oral histories. In fact, this is the way that I've been working in Bolivia now with the Moncosh indigenous peoples who I worked with since 2013. And I think it works much better in many ways, because you can record it in the local language and then subtitle it, and the local language is there. It has much more meaning. But the written form is very, very politically, is very strategic, because you're talking in the language of the dominator. And this was something that the Pemón very clearly chose to do. And when we write in the book, we discussed whether we were actually trying to write it in Taurepan. And they said, no, we don't want it in Taurepan. First, because it's a disaster. We don't even know how to write Taurepan. It's just there are no agreements, and when you read it, you have to really try to understand if the spelling is correct. It's very confusing. We want to write it in Spanish because we want those people that read Spanish to read it. And so strategically, they chose a book because they see it more as a legitimate and powerful way of collecting their knowledge. But it doesn't mean that there are no others. And in the videos that we've used in Bolivia, we've incorporated songs as well. We incorporate dramatizations that are told in their language, and it allows you much more diversity. So I've been working a lot, and songs definitely have a huge value in terms of capturing other knowledge in a different way. With respect to the second question about using ethnography and how that may distort in a way, I suppose that's how I interpreted the question. I think what is valuable in the case of the way that the story was told in the case of the Pemón is, I don't think we did ethnography really at all. I think what we did was oral histories in their own terms. And so they did their own collection of their own historical testimonies, interviewing elders among themselves about their history, their past, in their own terms. but we use photographs to help them, photographs that have been taken by colonialists, to help them give identity, give a visual picture. And of course, there is a language in those photographs, which is maybe the complex part of it, is there is a language. Many of the photographs are actually, if you see the indigenous peoples are not looking at the camera, they're looking down. There's a language behind it that is quite interesting to keep in mind for us as observers, but is the meaning that they attributed to the photographs, which I think is fascinating and important. And the fact that they tell the stories referring to the person that there has a name. That is Iokiñe, that was our auntie. And they give names to each one of those persons that are in the photographs, bringing them alive in a way that has no meaning for us. So they are actually resignifying material that was collected in a colonial way, in a colonial time, but for them it has a different meaning. And they give it that meaning in the way that they tell the stories. So yeah, I think it depends very much on how you interpret events and actions. So that's how I would answer. I don't know, maybe Paulina has a different way of, a different take to that question.
No, I mean, just to comment, I really love all your work there and all your thoughts. That's so interesting, and I look forward to talking about all this a lot more later. But
same with me with yours.
Yeah, and in the Benin Kingdom area or Edo State in Nigeria, it's actually ethnography doesn't really. There was one sort of ethnographer, but he sadly died quite young, so that was never developed very much, and then. Then it was sort of more or less just me, but I never really did, of course, ethnography. So there isn't really, but instead what you do have is you have some art historians, but you also have above all a lot of very good Edo historians. So a very famous sort of short history of, and a very, very, both in terms of written, so very good actual historians, but academics who are completely, published, well-known, like really very good, but also very huge, very rich, very good local historiography and oral history tradition. And also what I was always struck by, a very lively knowledge by everyone of a lot of, everyone, not just the sort of historians, but everyone of really knowing a lot of things. But what I find particularly interesting now, I was talking about this previously a little bit, is how things are now now feels like a very exciting time, like how things are, for example, through Twitter, people are posting a lot of things, pictures of like the oil lamp I showed you, of the lamps being used in Benin City. That is actually in the British Museum, but I came across it because of someone I follow on Twitter who posted it, who is from Edo State himself. And he actually also, just now, I wish I'd thought of it and I could show you here. I can maybe bring it later, but I have he just published a children's book about actually Aruan the Great, who is an absolute hero of Udo, the very place where I did my field work. So I know the story very well, but it's really amazing. He just did a children's book which is drawn like a sort of anime story, and it's very, very good. And then I read it to my son just the other day, who loves also in anime, and because he's very used to all these, Dragon Prince and all these things, the whole, the story of Aruan, which kind of completely mapped onto his understanding of how it was like a book that we just read that was really amazing, actually, how all these sort of different things came together. I wish I had it here for you to show you. I forgot. I can send you a link. It's Aruan the Great by here. So there are lots of different ways in which things are going back and forth and being used in imaginative ways locally, I would say. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think, unfortunately, we're probably going to have to end it. But I just wanted to, before we end, I do want to ask or at least bring these questions to the fore, because there are a couple of other questions that have come in. One about palm oil and the use in the diaspora and the everyday life of people who are abroad. How is it used, homemade or not, etc. And then there are a couple of questions related to how outreach work in European museums and some of the work that you both shared are actually contributing or can sort of force outcomes in these conflicts, or in these problematic, extractive industries, for example, and how we might think through more of the kind of political governmental stage. I mean, you talked a little bit about it, Iokiñe, about, using the book as a way to talk directly, to people in power. And so there's sort of a question about how museums can be tools of not only tools for these communities to then sort of rediscover this knowledge, but then also this tool as a form of activism, really. So I think that's something that, we can certainly think a little bit more about, and I think are really useful points to make. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have all the time in the world to, to answer all of the questions, but I just wanted to at least acknowledge those very thoughtful questions, and especially thinking through how we might relate both of your work to the remit of the project, and how it can help us think through these really valuable understandings that you've both brought today. So I'd like to thank you both for coming and sharing your fantastic research and fantastic ideas. And yes, just to say thank you to our audience as well for asking such insightful questions and putting some really interesting things in the chat. This session will be recorded, and we'll add the links that Paulina was just mentioning, and a couple of other links we'll make sure are very connected with the recording. So yes, thank you all for joining. And hopefully you'll be able to join us for our next webinar. We'll have a week off next week, and then we restart the conference series on the 29th of April. And we will be talking to another fantastic set of speakers about climate change activism through film. So we'll watch a couple of documentary films and get to speak to the filmmakers. So yes, thank you all, and have a lovely day, everyone.